there folks, Mr. G here with another educational video. This time we're going to be starting our biology unit, and we're going to start by talking about cells, different types of cells, and some of the theory behind it and where it all came from. Before we dive in though, make sure you put your name up at the top here, your block right here. So for you it would be day 2, period 2. The date today would be December 14th, and this is going to be page number 1 of our new unit. Now, before the 1770s, people believed that living organisms could just spontaneously generate. So, for instance, they believed mice could spontaneously generate if you mixed wheat and dirty shirts together and left them out for a few days. But with the advent of the microscope in the 1660s, Robert Hooke saw these small structures that looked like jail cells inside of tree bark, and this is what he called cells. So with this discovery, along with some other discoveries, people figured out that this spontaneous generation was not the right idea for where living things came from. Cell theory is this idea started by Robert Hooke and built on by many other scientists. The first idea is that the cell is the basic unit of life, the smallest thing we can call alive. And all living things are made of cells. Some are unicellular, which means they only have one cell, for instance, amoebas or bacteria. Multicellular organisms can have anywhere from 2 cells to millions or even more, as many cells as you can imagine. And multicellular organisms can have different types of cells to do different types of things. For instance, in our body, we have a bunch of different types of cells, like skin cells for our skin, muscle cells for our muscles, blood cells in our blood, nerve cells in our brain and through our nervous system. And our body is structured like this, where we have cells like a stomach cell, and a bunch of those together create tissue, stomach tissue. And with enough of this, we can form an entire stomach, which we call an organ. And this stomach interacts with a bunch of other types of organs in our digestive system. So a whole bunch of organs can create a digestive system. So organs like our small and large intestine, our throat, our mouth is all part of our digestive system. And then a bunch of these systems together. So our digestive system along with our cardiovascular, so that's for our blood and our heart, our brain, as well as many other systems combined together to create an organism, a whole human being. The third part of our cell theory is that new cells come from pre-existing cells. And this happens when a cell grows bigger and bigger until eventually it divides into 2 new cells. So for example, imagine we started with a big cell like this, right? And you've got stuff in here, maybe you've got parts of our cell which we'll learn about later. Eventually this gets large enough that what it starts to do, it forms kind of this shape as it starts to split up, and you see some of these parts splitting up like this, and then eventually this split results in 2 brand new cells afterwards. And this is how one cell can become more, and how we can create many, many different cells. Now, for thousands of years prior to cell theory, people thought diseases came from all sorts of places, for instance, foul-smelling or bad air, which is where malaria comes from. For those of you that speak French maybe, mal means bad, and area sounds like air. They also thought it was potentially imbalances of liquids in the body like blood and phlegm, and they treated this by using leeches or other means that we wouldn't really use today. So now we know that diseases come from microscopic germs, microbes that are spread through the air or on surfaces. These can come in the form of bacteria or viruses. And how does cell theory support this idea that diseases are caused by germs rather than bad air? Well, cell theory tells us that all things come from pre-existing things, so it would make sense that disease would come from germs that are already there rather than spontaneously generating. If we think about the mice example that we started off with, mice don't just spontaneously appear in piles of dirty clothes, and germs don't just spontaneously appear in foul-smelling air. They come from somewhere else. Same with these imbalances of liquid in the body. These imbalances don't cause diseases, but things that can enter the blood or into our phlegm can cause diseases. Now, there are many different types of cells, but there are 2 really broad categories: prokaryotic and eukaryotic. So there's a table here kind of going through the details of these sort of 2 big categories of cells. Eukaryotic cells are the type of cells that we have in our body. They have genetic material like DNA with a nucleus to protect it, and this is the most important distinction. Eukaryotic cells have this nucleus to protect our DNA. The prokaryotic ones don't. Their DNA just kind of floats around in the cell. Our eukaryotic cells also have tiny little organs that we'll learn about in a later lesson that do different jobs. The size of eukaryotic cells is much bigger, they're much more complex, and organisms made of these are called eukaryotes. So, for instance, we are a eukaryote. Prokaryotic cells do have DNA, but it's not protected. They don't have tiny organelles. They're quite small, not very complex, and that is the distinction between our eukaryotic and prokaryotic cells. So, for instance, eukaryotes would include plants, animals, fungi, microorganisms like tardigrades, which we'll see in a bit. Unicellular eukaryotes, so it's possible to have only one cell in these kind of large, more complex cells. Different fungi, plankton, protists like amoeba or euglena. And then usually prokaryotes, they can't form these complex systems. They can't form organisms that have more than one cell. Our prokaryotes are almost always one cell. Things like bacteria or archaea. So these are probably a little less familiar. Now, prokaryotes vastly outnumber all other life forms on Earth and have existed for at least 3.5 billion years, making them the oldest known life forms on the planet, and many people suspect these were some of the first life forms ever. And archaea are a specific type of these prokaryotes that can live in extreme environments. Very hot, freezing cold, acidic, alkaline, which means basic, salty, deep in the ocean, bombarded by all sorts of radiation. And this is because they have unique DNA and cell structures that allow them to consume all types of different or inorganic matter and survive in these extreme conditions, something no bacteria or eukaryote could do. Now, bacteria are a little more common. Some make us sick, but some actually help us, and a lot of bacteria is found inside our bodies, so in our digestive system and all throughout our body, and they help our body function properly. They can also be found in all sorts of our food, like bread, yogurt, in the dirt around us, even in the air. Now, one thing to mention, life on other planets are probably going to be these archaea, right? In these more extreme environments outside of our planet, which is a little more hospitable to life, there'll probably be these extreme organisms that survive in these extreme conditions. The last thing we're going to talk about today are the size of cells. So organisms are called microscopic if we need a microscope to see them. In other words, we can't see them with our own eyes. Microscopic organisms are usually quite small. And one of the units that we commonly use is nm to give their size. That stands for nanometer, which is 1/1000th of a meter, or it takes 1 billion nanometers to make up 1 meter. So it's basically taking up 1 meter and dividing it into a billion pieces. Each of those pieces is 1 nanometer. So it's really, really small. Now, we've done unit conversions before. Our base unit here is the meter, so we're measuring a distance or a length. And our prefix, the word that goes in front of it, is nano, and that means 1/1,000,000th, or split into a billion pieces. So is a nanometer smaller or larger? It's very clearly smaller. These are tiny, tiny units. To give you a sense of scale, there's a few sizes listed out here, along with what I think is a very helpful diagram to sort of let you see how big or small things are relative to each other. Plant and animal cells are about the same size, between 10,000 and about 100,000 nanometers. Bacteria are smaller, about 1,000 to 10,000, and viruses can be quite small, all the way down to 50 nanometers, but usually not much bigger than 500 nanometers. So viruses are very, very small compared to the rest of these cells. Now, another common unit here that we use for small things, a little bit bigger, but small things nonetheless, this right here is called a micrometer. And this symbol right in front is called a mu, which is mu. It's a Greek letter. And the way you draw mu is you do a straight line upwards, and then you just draw a U shape afterwards. So it's a straight line plus a U. And for our micrometer, this is not 1 billion, but it's 1 million. So 1 meter would equal 1 million micrometers. Now, we said our eukaryotic cells, our plant and animal cells, usually go down to about 10,000 nanometers long, but some of the smallest ones can go down to around 8,000. Now, what would we do to convert 8,000 nanometers into micrometers? Well, what we need to recognize that a billion to a million, that's 1,000 times bigger. Then our micrometer is 1,000 times bigger than our nanometer. So micrometer is a little bit bigger than our nanometer is. So in this case, we're going from a smaller unit to a bigger unit. If we're going from a smaller unit to a bigger unit, we have to have a smaller number as our answer, so we're going to be dividing. And since it's 1,000 times, so 3 factors of 10 or 3 steps on that little diagram that we would have to continue to include all these units. It's going to be 3 steps, but in this case, we're going to be dividing because we're going from a smaller unit to a bigger unit. So 8,000 divided by 1,000 gives us an answer of 8 micrometers for the smallest eukaryotic cells. Now, salmon eggs are about 5 millimeters in length. Now we're going to convert millimeters into micrometers. Millimeters are now the bigger unit, so we're going from a bigger unit to a smaller unit, and millimeters are 1,000 times bigger than a micrometer. So 1 millimeter is 1,000 micrometers. Since we're going from a bigger unit to a smaller unit, our answer is going to be a bigger number. So we're going to be multiplying by 1,000 here. And we get that our salmon eggs are about 5,500 micrometers. That's the end of our video here. Please make sure you watch the rest of the videos I post. Check for all of the other homework, worksheets, assignments, and other questions for you to do. And I will see you all in the next video.